to Roberts and Jennis Live. This time for June the 11th in the year of our Lord 2025. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And in my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, tradition, scripture, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the saints, the doctors, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And usually at the top of the program, we have some email questions that have come in, and we will begin to answer them forthwith. And we also have a chat board. Now, for some reason, the chat board is not working. Oh boy. Here we go again. Sorry, folks. I don't know how to fix it. You know, the only time I know that it's not working is when I come on the program. So forgive me for this is ridiculous. Yeah, I'm going to have to contact these people somehow and get this fixed. Yeah, so sorry. Like I said, I don't know what to do about it. Because I only have one button. It says chat, and that is it. So now we do have a lot of email questions today. So I could go the whole 2 hours just on these email questions. So I may have to do that, not by choice, but because I'm forced to do it. So at any rate, I'm very sorry. I will try to get this fixed, and I'm not sure what to do because it worked fine last week. All right, so let me start with the email questions. And all right, let me go here. So without any further ado, all right, Dr. St. Jennis from Corwin says, what is the status of the axis of evil? I have seen claims that more recent data shows it is not there, or not so much. Of course, that's from the enemy's sites. What's the truth? Well, if you go to the right sources, Corwin, you're going to find that it's still there, and they're still complaining about it, and they don't know what to do with it. You're going to get some popular, people out there. Here comes the question. Okay, so it looks like the chat room is working. Okay, so, all right, maybe you guys are just slow today. Maybe that's what the problem was. Okay. So if you don't know what the axis of evil is, it is a term that was given to some radiation that permeates the universe. That term was given by two astrophysicists, Kate Land and Wao Maguejo, both very good. I think they are teaching at the London, what is that? I forget the name of the university. Anyway, peer-reviewed astrophysicists. So they termed the name axis of evil because at that time George Bush was saying that Korea, who else? Iraq, Iran, somebody else was the axis of evil. And Oh, the good old days. George Bush. Um, so they took the name from George, and they called it the axis of evil because the radiation formed a axis, a line, a direction in the universe, from basically like southwest to northeast, right through the ecliptic of the sun and earth. That shouldn't be. If you're a big banger, it's all by chance. It's all homogeneous. There's no distinguishing marks out there. So to have a line that goes from southwest of the universe to the northeast, that's just, you know, absolutely anathema to these people. So yeah, there's going to be some people coming along, well, it really doesn't exist, or not so much. Well, even if it exists a little bit, that's too much for them. Okay, so that's the problem. It's an all or nothing game. It's either all homogeneous, and if there is some anisotropy, it can be explained, but you can't have an anisotropy that runs a line from the southwest to the northeast of the whole universe. You just can't have that. Okay? It's like somebody actually drew a line from one end of the universe to the other. That's how disturbing it is for them. And they've said, look, they've sent 3 probes up in 20 some odd years. The Kobe probe, 1990, the WMAP probe in 2001, and the Planck probe in 2009, which its data was analyzed starting in 2014. They all said the same thing. It's all there. And they actually found it even before 1990, in 1978, when they sent the balloons up in the atmosphere. They already saw the cosmic radiation. So you basically have 4 sources. And they found out there's no contamination. The instruments work fine. There's nothing disturbing the radiation so that, we're getting a double effect or somewhere. It's just not there. Now, that's after 20 years, 20 plus years. And you got popular commentators today like Becky Smithhorst and Amy Liu, who just recently, in the last few months, have talked about the axis of evil. And they're secular astrophysicists. A lot of women are getting involved in astrophysics today. So Becky Smithhorst and Amy Liu, and just look them up. You'll find their videos saying, yeah, the axis of evil, it exists. It's a trouble to the Copernican principle, blah, blah, blah. The same thing we've been saying for the last 10 years, since we made our movie, The Principle. This is something that they don't know what to do with. So, yeah, you're going to get some complaints out there. As far as I know, there's only one peer-reviewed paper who tried to rebut the axis of evil, and that was written in 2016. And 3 gentlemen wrote it, and they really didn't rebut the axis of evil. What they did was said, okay, there's 3 other alternatives to why the axis of evil exists. So they admitted that it existed right off the bat. And they tried to give another explanation to sort of counter the idea that the Earth was somehow special. They didn't like that. So the way they countered it was two ways that's difficult to explain to you here. But one of the ways, believe it or not, was that the universe was rotating. And this has come out before from some other astrophysicists. I think it was, what's his name? Longo from Michigan, who said one way to explain the anisotropy of the axis of evil is you have a rotating universe. Well, glory be to God, because that's exactly what geocentrism is. You have a center of mass, which is occupied by the Earth, and the universe is rotating. Because a rotating universe defines one axis, just one. That's the rotation axis. Okay? So if it defines an axis, well, don't be surprised if the axis of evil defines another axis that's what? That would be 77 degrees away from it, because that would be at the 23.5 degree angle. That's where the ecliptic is. So thank you for that paper written in 2016. You admit the axis of evil is there, and then you admit the exact reason we believe it's there, because you have a rotating universe. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, that's done. This is from Bernardo. I have been reading your work on 60 Ways to Refute a Catholic Heliocentrist. By the way, if you haven't gotten that book yet, you should get it. Here we are with the book 60 Ways to Refute a Catholic Heliocentrist. And my opponents are Cardinal Walter Bramuller and Eric Sammons. Eric Sammons is the chief editor of Crisis Magazine. Decided to take a few shots at us, so I took a couple of shots at him. And all scientific, though. And Cardinal Bramuller decided to get in on the act and say that, no problem with the Galileo issue. The church solved that back in 1820. And he's got his facts all mixed up. So I spent a good portion of the time coming after him. And I'm trying to find his address. If anybody out there can help, I've tried one source and we haven't been able to get it yet. And how many pages is this, by the way? 167, 68. I want to get his address because I want to send it to him as free of charge, of course, and just to let him know the other side of the story. So if you can help find Cardinal Walter Brandmuller's address, I would appreciate it. Anyway, Bernardo continues. I must say I am a big fan of your work altogether, but I wanted to ask about the quotes from Cardinal Bramuller regarding Olivieri and Satelli's imprimatur. When you quote Bramuller, who himself quotes Olivieri, saying, "Nothing is more false than this. The canon Satelli wants to teach the stability of the sun in the center of the world." Do you have that citation? Yes. Now, that didn't come from Bramuller. Okay, that came from Galileo Was Wrong, Volume 3. So I do have it in there. What I suggest you do, Bernardo, if you're hearing this show, is go to my email address, stgenis@aol.com or robertsongenis@gmail.com, and ask me for the quote of that paragraph, and I'll be glad to give it to you. I'm surprised I didn't have it in the book. But I got the Olivieri quotes from one source. Well, who was it? Yeah, I'll look it up and I'll give it to you. Okay, Brenda says, what is the Catholic view of Matthew 24? I understand the dispensational view is its future during the tribulation, where 144,000 Jews preach the gospel to the nations. But my issue with that is the gospel is going to all the nations now, which means Satan is bound now in Revelation 20. And another issue is how Jesus says to them, "You and this generation," as if he is speaking to the future. Okay, so let me try to sum up. Now, the Catholic Church does not have an official interpretation of Matthew 24. Okay, there's very few verses that the Catholic Church has an official interpretation on, unless they deal directly with salvation. That's where you usually find de fide statements. This is more eschatology, the future. And eschatology is one area where the church really needs some work, believe me. And I'm here to help as much as I can. But a lot of them are entrenched in some, not so good ideas. And we'll get to them later on, as a matter of fact. But one way to look at Matthew, well, I think the correct way to look at Matthew 24, because Matthew 24 is difficult, because you have a mixture of history and the future in one chapter. And the question is, where do you divide it up? How do you understand when the passage is shifting from the history, 70 AD, let's say, 33 AD, to the future, 2000 plus, okay, when the world comes to an end? Because that's the way the chapter opens. The apostles asked Jesus, when is the consummation and the end of the world? Okay, now if we're going to take the phrase end of the world as representing the end of the world, okay, and not the end of an era or an age, but the world, because the word cosmos is used there, okay, and there is only one conflagration at the end when everything collapses. That's the end of the world. So that has to be in there. And the question is, okay, how do you fit it in? So here you go. From verses 1 to 3 is the question. From verses 4 to 14 is the time period from when Jesus is speaking, 33 AD, to 2000 plus and the end of the world. So all that time period from verses 4 to 14 of Matthew 24. So write this down so you have it. So when you read Matthew 24, you can say, oh, okay, I know what this section is referring to now. Then from verses 15 to 22, you have Jesus dealing with the period only of 33 AD when he's speaking to 70 AD when, Titus comes down and destroys Jerusalem. Okay, 33 to 70 AD. Then from verses 23 to 28, you have again, it's going back to the time Jesus is speaking, 33 AD to 2000 plus, the end of the world. Okay, from verses 23 to 28. And then from verses 29 to 31, it's only dealing with the end of the world, 2000 plus years at the end of the world, from 29 to 31. And if you remember, that's the one, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars will fall from heaven, blah, 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 blah. Okay? He will send out his angels to the four corners of the world. They will gather his elect. That's the end of the world. That is not AD 70. Okay? And then from verses 32 to 35, you go back to the time Jesus is talking, 33 AD, all the way to 2000 plus, the end of the world. Okay? And then from 36 to 42, same thing, 33 AD to 2000 plus. So most of the chapter is dealing with the time Jesus is speaking at his first coming to the end of the world, except for two places. One is verses 15 to 22, which is speaking only of 33 AD to 70 AD, and only verses 29 to 31, which speaks of the end of the world exclusively. Okay? Now that should help you break up that chapter so that it's not confusing. The time overlaps are not confusing. Okay? And what else did you want to know? All right. I'm going to go to my commentary here. I'm going to read you the last part of it. And you should get this, Brenda. Get my commentary on Matthew, Mark, Matthew, and John. Okay. Volume 1, that is Volume 1, Matthew, Mark, and John. And that's like about 700 pages. But you'll get everything you need, all the detail that you need. And everything that I just gave you from Matthew 24 about how to dissect it time-wise, you will get that in the book, because that's where I was getting it from, my own commentary. Okay, so let me answer this last question you have here by giving you a sample of what's in the commentary. Okay, so so if you're not familiar with this, Jesus is saying in verse 32, and from the fig tree learn the parable. When its branch is tender and the leaves come forth, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Amen, I say to you, this generation shall not pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Now, in the footnote here, I have that this issue is covered in Matthew 23, which is the chapter before, Matthew 23:36. And so what we'll do is we'll go back to Matthew 23:36. And we shall read from there. Just hang on a second and I'll be right with you. It's so big, the volume is so big that it takes a while for my scroll to work. All right, so we have this phrase, this generation. It has the article te and the demonstrative adjective tauten, and that's, so it's in the Greek it would be te tauten, geneo, generation, and that's the emphatic way of pointing out the generation of people then living. Okay, because if you say in English this generation, the Greek has a more emphatic way of saying it. It would be like saying this very generation or this same generation. When it has te taute geneo, that's an emphatic way. So that much we can get from the Greek grammar. So it's pointing out the people then living upon whom all the sins of the past would be visited in a sudden avalanche, so to speak. For example, the Pharisees and the Sadducees whom Jesus had been admonishing. God has been holding back his wrath to a certain extent, and now it's going to fall like an avalanche upon this generation. This Greek phrase also appears in Matthew 11:16, Matthew 12:41, 42, Mark 8:12, Luke 7:31, Luke 11:30, 31, 32, 50, 51, and 17:25, serving the same function. That is, this same generation. a slightly less specific phrase, taute genetai. Now that doesn't have the article te, so you just have taute genetai instead of te ten taute genetai. Appears in Matthew 24:34, Mark 13:30, Luke 21:32, and may refer either to the present generation or a particular kind of generation, that is an evil one. So generation used in a timeless sense appears in, so now there's a third use of generation in the timeless sense. There's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 verses for that. The fact Abel was a Gentile murdered by a Gentile coincides with the more pervasive connotation of generation. So those are other ways that generation can be used. They're not used that way here in the primary sense of this very generation, okay? But you can extend it to generation in the general sense, okay? So here's another difficulty with Matthew 24. Since it's covering two different time periods, the context is covering two different time periods. One is 33 AD to 70 AD. The other is 33 AD to 2000 plus AD. You got two different time periods, so you have to have two different understandings of generation. One would be the generation of that day, this very generation, and then you could extend it to a general generation, the generation of evil. And that's what some commentators have done. But sometimes they do that without seeing that the primary meaning is this exact generation, this very generation, that is the Jews of 33 to 70 AD. Okay? So I hope that helps you. All right. Somebody says here, Father Rippiger recently said that Adam was tempted by the devil first and Adam refused, according to the fathers of the church. Well, with all due respect to Father Rippiger, I love the man. Really do. He is just exceptional. On this one, I'd have to disagree. I have never come across a father that has said that. Now, I'm not saying that I'm, the expert and I've read all the fathers and, know every wrinkle. I'm just saying I've never come across it. So I'm surprised. Now, sometimes what happens is, and Catholics are prone to this, they'll read one father or two fathers and they'll agree on something and they'll say, well, the fathers say. No, it's just those two fathers. If you find some more, great. Okay. But two fathers, three fathers, four fathers, that's not a consensus. Okay. There's many times where three or four fathers say the same thing and a lot of other ones disagree. Okay. Look, these guys are on their own. They're not inspired by the Holy Spirit. What they have is what was given to them from, hundreds of years ago, left over from the apostles, so to speak, the apostolic oral tradition. And they're trying to get that as best they can. And God's not helping in the sense that, oh, here's what you forgot. Here's what you need. He's not doing that. Okay. They're on their own in the sense that they get information here, information there, and they put it all together. They try to synthesize it and get to the truth. And that's the way the fathers normally dealt. Okay. They're not some special people that, had this special sense of theology and the Bible and all that. In many ways, they're primitive. Okay. The greatest thing the fathers have is that they're closest to the apostolic tradition. And the closer you are, the more likely you can have it, as opposed to somebody who's in the 20th century or 21st century. Okay? Even then, it's not so true anymore, because we have ways of getting to these documents and these sources that they didn't have before. Okay? Sometimes they had more than we had. Sometimes we have more than they do. Okay? So it's, you just never know. But if you're going to say the Father said, you got to be very careful, because unless you have a consensus of fathers, which means you're going to have to look up, a dozen, 24 fathers and see if they all say the same thing. And if you get 24 or so that say the same thing, then you could say, yeah, there's a consensus of the patristic witness on this particular issue. If you don't, you just have one father or two fathers, which often is the case with Catholics quoting the fathers. They get one or two fathers and, oh, no, we have a consensus. No, you don't even have a quorum, much less a consensus. Okay, so we got to be very careful as Catholics when we make claims about what the fathers say. Now, if you want to talk about geocentrism, yeah, there you have the consensus. Why? Because every one of the fathers that talked about it defended it, even against the Greeks that were teaching heliocentrism, like the Pythagorean school that the magisterium mentioned to Galileo. Why are you following the Pythagoreans? Yeah, they were all heliocentrists, even though Aristotle was a geocentrist. But Aristarchus, around the same time as Aristotle, he was a heliocentrist, continuing the Pythagorean school. And the fathers knew this. And they still said, no, the Bible says the world is in the middle, it doesn't move. Okay? As a consensus. Now, I know it's a consensus because I looked up all the verses, all the passages in the fathers. Okay? There's about 24 of them. And they're the ones that talked about it. So that's a consensus. This idea that somehow Adam was tempted and resisted, and then when the devil came to Eve, she didn't resist, it doesn't make sense. I mean, not only is there not a consensus, it doesn't make sense, because the next verse says, and Adam also ate. Eve gave it to him, and Adam also ate. So how could he have resisted first, and then when Eve is tempted by the devil, Adam, loses all sensibility and now starts eating it? It just doesn't make sense. You can't resist at one point and then, unless Eve has some power over him, which I doubt. So I'd have to say no on that one. To Father Ripperger. Okay. Dear Robert, question on Fatima. How do you interpret this at present? In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. Now that Portugal in recent times has become as liberal as all the rest of Europe. Be it a few decades later, it's catching up real quickly. Not only the state that is homosexual marriage, allowing it in 2010, legalized abortion in 2007, but isn't it also the church as liberal as you can get? Yeah, I'd have to agree. As a matter of fact, one of the facts I found out when I wrote my recent Fatima book is that, who has the highest divorce rate in the world? Yeah, Portugal. At 70%. The other nations are like, 50, 55, 45, they're pretty high up too, but 70%? What happened? Right? So, I did some investigation on this phrase. In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. etc. Now that's an odd thing. Etc. This is in the fourth memoir of Sister Lucia. She wrote it in 1941. And I've had problems with this from the beginning, just like you have had. And so I went back to her original writing, which you can find online. It's easy to find. And besides a little margin problem that I found, we'll accept that for the time being. I'm wondering, now I'm not an expert in Portuguese, okay? But I can read Portuguese and translate it with Google and a lot of other expert translation things now. And you can pretty much know what's going on. I know a little Spanish. I know that's not exactly the same, but I know a little Italian. I know that's not exactly the same, but they're close where you can sort of get a feel for what's going on here. And then we do have translations of the original Portuguese from other parts of what Sister Lucia said. So I looked at this phrase, this clause again, in Portugal, the dogma of faith will always be preserved. And I'm wondering if this is right. Because now in Portugal is correct, because that would be em Portugal in Portuguese. But the word dogma, I wonder where they're getting that from. Because that's not the word that she uses. And I was just as shocked to see this as you are. Because, and you can prove this by the fact that the word that she uses, Guerra, Guerra, is used elsewhere in her third memoir. Twice it's used. Okay, and one time it's used where it says, let me see if I can find it. I didn't write it down, darn it. Many souls will be saved. There will be peace. The war is going to end. All right. So you remember that place where it says, if what I say to you is done, this is Our Lady talking, many souls will be saved and there will be peace, period. The war is going to end. Now that word war is the Portuguese word Guerra, Guerra, which is the same word that she uses in the clause in question. She says, Guerra de fe, etc. Now, how they get dogma out of that is my question. Because the word means war or fight, something along the, something, horrible. Now, there's another place where she uses the same word. It says here, when you see a night illumined by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God, that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war. And that's the same exact word, Guerra. Okay, so we got, twice now, where Guerra is referring to war, nothing else. And that's exactly the same word used in this clause in question. Okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is Portuguese apparently does not have a word for dogma. Okay? It has a word for doctrine. Doutrina is the Portuguese word for doctrine. But how many times have we seen the word dogma in the clause in question? And they don't even have a word for dogma, which is surprising. Okay. Now, if they had put doutrina in there, in Portugal, the doutrina of the faith will always be preserved, would have made sense. But they put the word Guerra, she put the word Guerra in there, which to me means something different. And I would say, with the little knowledge that I have about Portuguese, but I would say in Portugal, a fight for the faith will always be preserved. Something along those lines is what she means. Or you could say a fight for the faith will continue in Portugal. Something along those lines. Because Guerra does not mean dogma. It means fight or war. You could say the war of the faith will continue in Portugal. Now, I may be looking at this totally wrong. If somebody wants to correct me, I'm open. Okay? But I just happened to look at this and compared the words that are used in the context with, and I spent quite a long time on this, trying to get it just right. So that sounds more reasonable to me, that in Portugal, the fight for the faith or the war for the faith is going to continue, because in 1941, that's exactly what was happening in Portugal. Who was it? The Masons had come in there in the 1930s and tried to wreak havoc in Portugal. And Freemasons were there. And they almost upset the whole country, except Antonio Salazar started to ban them in 1935. That's just 6 years before this fourth memoir is written. So, and he did a pretty good job getting them out of there. And so we can say safely that Portugal continued fighting for the faith. Okay, so that certainly makes more sense, because they did that throughout the 1940s. And Our Lady is speaking in present time, real time, her time. Okay, so as all these other nations are falling left and right by the attack of Russia, Portugal's holding on, continuing the fight of the faith, as St. Paul even uses. Fight for the faith. Okay, it is a war out there, and we're soldiers of Christ. Okay, so that would make more sense. And it doesn't have us scrambling now. Well, gee, if Portugal's always going to preserve the faith, did heaven fib to us? Because look at them now. Well, remember, this whole thing is based on a period piece. And remember what I've said before. After I did my grand second look at the Fatima thing and started to pay attention to more of what happened with Pius XII, boy, did I find something out, which is Pius XII, just like Pius XI, was reticent to do any consecration at all. And the most he wanted to do was do a consecration of the world, which is how that got into the picture. The men think that they know better than heaven. Even the Pope thinks he knows better than heaven. Heaven says, consecrate Russia. That's it. Finito. You don't need to consecrate anybody else, because that's where the problem is, in Russia. And how do we know Russia? They turned atheist in 1917. And so by this time, they're very atheist. And they want to conquer the world, as any atheist wants to do. Okay? And Pius wants to he wants to consecrate the world. Somehow that's going to be better than consecrating Russia. So... And then, of course, you got Pius XI, who doesn't do anything. He sits on his hands for 10 years. And he was told in 1929, go consecrate Russia. But he's too busy making deals with them, as was Pius XII, and as was Cardinal Montini, who became Pope Paul VI. Yeah, they all had their hands in this. And just because they don't trust heaven, they trust themselves. And they think they're going to be the big daddies. They're going to corral Russia. Yeah. So what happened, if you don't remember me talking about this, Sister Lucia is trying to get Pius the 12th. Pius the 11th had died, so they're trying to get Pius the 12th because they know how serious this is. That's one person who knows how serious this is, and that's Sister Lucia and her confidant, Father Consalvas. And they're working together to try to get Pius the 12th to do the consecration. And so Jesus now takes over. He has since 1931. Mary is no longer in the picture as far as communicating with Sister Lucia. The next time Mary would communicate with Sister Lucia would be 1952, 10 years after this time that we're talking about. Jesus is taken over, and they make a deal. Sister Lucia makes a deal with Jesus for Pius the 12th. And because Pius the 12th had suggested, well, let me just do a consecration of the world. So he's still sticking to his guns. And so Sister Lucia brings this to Jesus, and he says, yeah, sure, that's fine. But make sure you mention Russia at the end. Okay? Okay. So she brings that back to old Pius the 12th. And he does his little world consecration in 1942. And guess what? He doesn't add Russia at the end of it. So he disobeyed what Jesus said. He reneged on the agreement. And so Sister Lucia brings this back, and Jesus, of course, already knows it. But she tells Jesus, and he says, okay, so for that disobedience, what's going to happen is this. The war's going to go on longer because it would have stopped if he had mentioned Russia. It's going to go on for 2.5 more years, which it did until 1945. And the peace that was promised, that's not going to come for a while. So you just fixed your own goose. Okay, so this is the environment that's going on with this whole. And here you have Portugal right in the midst of this, holding the faith, fighting for the faith. You see, something that Italy wasn't doing in Rome. No wonder Our Lady would point out Portugal, holding fast to the faith. So that's what happens. The war goes on in 1945. The peace does not come. Jesus says it's going to be longer. And to get the process started again, Our Lady now comes back into the picture and comes to Sister Lucia in an apparition, 1952, which would be May 1952, and says, heaven still awaits the consecration of Russia. So after all that fumble-ditty that Pius XII did, it's like he's haunted by Our Lady. By the way, I'm still here. Still waiting for you to obey me. And let's see what you do now. Now that you've been chastised by my son, who means business, obviously. He's not talking out of his hat. And you experienced it. A war for 2.5 more years. Where your name was dragged through the mud, by the way. Yeah. So you better think again before you decide to refuse what heaven said. So guess what? Within 2 months, Pius XII consecrates Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. He uses those exact words in his declaration. Okay, so now you obey. Now we'll see what heaven's going to do. And as you know, by the late 50s, Sister Lucia is no longer talking. She talked to Father Fuentes in 57, and that was it. We never hear from her again. And so by the 1960s, late 50s, 1960s, all these peace proposals are made with Russia by the U.S. and other countries. The SALT talks, the this talk, the that talk. They had about a half a dozen of these talks that all corralled Russia so that Russia could not permeate the world with her atheism. She had done a lot of damage, but it was going to be stopped. And now, as of 1993, guess what? Yeah, Russia made Christianity the focus of its constitution, allowed Christianity to come in now and be a part of Russian society. Whereas before, in 1917, they were kicking Christians out by the truckload, literally. So it did change. It just took a while to get there. Okay. So that's what happened. And in the midst of this, we find Portugal, fighting for the faith, which is good. All right. Let me go on to the next question here. Could you tell me something? This is from Paul. Could you tell me something about the presence of Moses and Elias at the Transfiguration? Where were Elias and Moses before the Transfiguration, and where did they go afterwards? And were they in the same place? Or different places? Or were they together or apart? Well, they were in heaven. Okay? They were in heaven. Elijah, some say Elias, that's from the Septuagint, went to heaven in a whirlwind, it says in 2 Kings chapter 1. Okay? So his body and soul went into heaven, and that's where he was. There's no other place. Okay? He's not in paradise, as you say, or Eden. That's gone. That's been destroyed. Okay? So they were both in heaven. And Moses, remember, they could not find his burial site, which explains why his body is not there. They could never find Moses' body. And the obvious explanation to that is the fact that he went to heaven, just like Elijah did, in body and soul, which is why both of them could come back in body and soul at the Mount of Transfiguration. Okay? It makes perfect sense. And you say, could you let me know if your answer is conjecture, define, teaching, blah, blah, de fide, or is it logical conclusion? Well, I think I'm making a logical conclusion based on the information Scripture gives us. And as far as de fide, you're going to find very few verses in the Catholic Church that are defined de fide. The only ones, as I said, will be, the prominent salvation verses, things like that, but very few. You're lucky if you find more than a dozen of them. Okay? Which means everything else is going to have to be figured out. And we've had 2,000 years to do it. So, now you say, my understanding is that Elias, along with Enoch, may be in paradise or Eden. No. Waiting for the end times. No. They being the two witnesses. No. Okay. Elijah and Enoch are not the two witnesses of Apocalypse 11. That is all symbolic. And those who try to literalize it fall into the trap of trying to name who it is. Whether it's Elias or Enoch or Jeremiah or Moses. Okay? We've had 4 different people assigned to who the two witnesses are. That's just all symbolic. Symbolic of the witness of the church, because the number 2, Jesus sent out the 70, 2 by 2. Okay, you have 2 or 3 witnesses, according to Paul, for every established fact. That's just the nature of the symbolism of the number 2. You got symbolism all over the apocalypse. The number 7 is used 49 times, 7 times 7. That's symbolic. Okay? The number 12, the number 10, they're all used symbolically. So when you try to squeeze people into that, saying, oh, and, this is where some Catholic interpretations gets pretty primitive. Okay? Because, anyway, I don't want to go into that right now. And Moses is not in the limbo of the fathers, okay, waiting to come out. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. If Moses is in the limbo of the fathers, he's going to be there till the end of time. So how could he come out in his soul existence? Because his body would be in the grave and stand on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus in AD 33. Okay, that's not going to be possible. Okay, so I think I answered your question. You have a lot more to say here about geocentrism, how much you love it, and you've been educated so much, and I'm glad we could all do that for you, and just keep learning. That's all I got to say. Just keep learning. All right. Sorry, I told you this was going to take a long time. We got so many questions today, and I'm still not done. And so hang on, people. We'll get to your chat thing in the next hour, hopefully. All right. So this is from Nick. Nick says, I have a few questions for your upcoming live stream. I'll understand if you don't take the time to spoon feed me the answers to the cosmological questions. I have begun to study your books. 1. Is creation a gift from God the Father to God the Son? I read that in some of the introductory material to my 1962 missal. It seemed strange to me, and stranger still when I saw that the Douay-Rheims does not use for, the word for, in Colossians 1:16, saying instead that all things exist through Christ and in him. I noticed that some of the other translations use for, including the one in the USCCB website. I am assuming the answer is yes, and any problems in my inchoate understanding is in my inchoate understanding. But I would appreciate it if you could flesh this out for me. So I'm wondering if the NAB, because the USCCB usually uses the RSV for their translations, which is not so good sometimes because it is very Protestantized. So let me get Colossians up here and see what they do with it. Okay, RSV says, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Verse 16 says, for in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, principalities, authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Now, let me, here it is. Let me look at Colossians 1:16 and 17 in the Greek. And then I can tell you. So just hang on. All right. 1:16. Because in him were created all things in the heavens and on the earth, the invisible and the visible, whether thrones or lordships or rulers or authorities, all ponta di auto kai es auton tistai. So that would be, if you have the ace there, that would be most likely for. All things through him and for him. Ace can also mean in, though. That's the problem. So you really could not make a definitive conclusion on this. Verse 17 is kai autos estin pro panton kai ta panta en auto sun estiken. So that would be all things in him consisted, but it doesn't necessarily hold the word for. You can't say kai ta panta ace auto sun estiken. It wouldn't fit. So that in there means in him consisted everything. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what it says. Through him and for him have been created. So you could make an argument that the ace there is a for in the sense that it's like a gift to him, but you'd have to have something else to back it up. You just can't take one verse out of the passage and say, okay, now it's a gift. You're going to have to do a study on that and use the word gift, dorea, and then see where that is used. If it's ever used in a context of the Father giving the world as a gift, that would be a good study for somebody to do. So, Nick, you're up. Why don't you do that? Okay? That way I won't spoon feed you. Okay, let's see what else you have here. How does the ether stretch out? You explained a few weeks ago how starlight gets to the Earth so quickly via the thinning out of the ether as one goes outward in the universe. You also stated on the Tim Pool show that the ether must be made of the smallest possible particles, because if there were anything between them, that would be the medium. Very good, Nick. Glad you see that. I'm assuming the particles themselves are stretched out. I might have answered my own question, but I'd appreciate some elaboration on the ether. Well, first of all, the force that would be stretching it out, and the reason we use the stretching out is because that's what Scripture does. There's 10 verses outside of Genesis, Isaiah, the Psalms, Jeremiah. I think there's one in Zechariah too, where God says, I stretched out the heavens. And this is during the creation week. Okay, so God's doing the stretching. We're just trying to fill in the material here that would work best. Okay. So if we're talking about the Planck particles as the underlying substructure of all things material, can they stretch? My answer would be that even if they couldn't stretch, let's say the diameter of the Planck particle is 10 to the minus 35 meters, and it's not going to move. Okay. That's an assumption that we'll make just for the sake of argument, because it could be very flexible, you see. But if it didn't move, then what would happen if a centrifugal force, which is going to be generated by a rotating universe on the Planck medium, well, if it can't stretch, then it's going to have tension. It's going to have great tension. Okay, it might be able to withhold the tension because of the superstructure of that material, Planck material, but it's still going to have tension. Okay, how it's going to work out, we can figure that out. But principally speaking, that's what's going to happen. You're going to have tension, and the more tension you have on the medium, guess what? The faster the thing that's going through it is going to go. Okay, so whether it's tension or an actual stretching, okay, and remember we have two issues here. We have the firmament, which we said because of the way it acts in Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2, the best element we know of that can fulfill all that is hydrogen. And we see hydrogen all over the universe. 90% of the universe is made of hydrogen. So we don't really have to guess much about where the firmament came from, what it is, and what it was when it stretched out. Okay? But then you have this other underlying substance that fills in all the spaces of the hydrogen atoms. And that's the Planck particle. You have to, or else it's nothing and you can't have nothing. So if that can't stretch, and the firmament did with its hydrogen, then you have tension. And the more tension you have, the more that medium is going to allow the speed of light to go through it, especially because it's flexible and invisible. Okay? Now you can test this out with, as a matter of fact, I think I did this on ChatGPT, where I said, if you have a, how did I put it? I think I said something like, if you have a medium of which light goes through and you call it a vacuum, and yet you know that it's not a true vacuum because you have quantum particles inside that vacuum at 10 to the minus 35 meters per particle, and a density of 10 to the 94th grams per cubic centimeter. That's pretty dense. So ChatGPT, you know that's the underlying feature of the so-called vacuum, and it admitted it. It said, yes, the quantum particles are the vacuum, and thus the light is going through a substance. Thank you. See, they bandy about this word vacuum like Einstein did to get you to think of the idea that there's nothing there, and that's why the light can go at 186,000 miles a second, because there's nothing there to impede it. Well, what about these Planck particles that quantum mechanics talks about? See, Einstein didn't like that idea. Well, he did have his, what they call the Einstein-Rosen conduit, or concept. What was it? What did he call it? It was a substance that he wanted to fill space with. I forget. I have the book, and it's been 10 or so years since I read it. But he had an idea on his own with two other guys about filling space with something. But the general idea from special relativity was we have a vacuum, and that's why light can go so fast. Well, let's put quantum particles in this vacuum, okay? And ChatGPT agreed. And then I said, if you stretched out the Planck particles, would light go faster? And it said yes. Okay, so again, I don't know if I mentioned. Oh, I just said if you had a force that would stretch out the particles, would light go faster? Yes. Now, I didn't tell him it was centrifugal force because I didn't get into a rotating universe. But ChatGPT agrees to a rotating universe that will create centrifugal forces. That I've already discussed that with it, and it agrees. And it also agrees that at the same time, you're going to have countering forces from the Coriolis side. So you have the outward centrifugal force that puts tension on the particles, and then you have a counter force called the Coriolis that's going to bring all these celestial bodies in line with the rotating universe so that they don't move anywhere. Well, that's pretty good for ChatGPT. So, yeah. Things are looking up. All right, so I think I answered that question. What do you make of the experiments that claim to vindicate Einstein on time dilation? It's easy enough to see how an ether that can be thinner or denser could distort light that Einstein claims is bent by space. But time is another story. It would seem that you believe that time and space are absolute. Is it possible that the general theory is true and that God created a universe where time itself speeds up and slows down? I'm guessing no. If not, what of the experiments with clocks? Well, clocks don't change time. They just change the rate that they move. Okay? That's a natural occurrence. You can stick a clock, hand clock, up a grandfather clock, up at 10,000 at the top of Mount Everest, and it's going to go faster than a clock on the ground. Okay? Why? Because the gravity's thinner at 29,000 feet. A lot thinner. Okay? So the clock thing is always, they always put this out there like, well, the clocks change. Yeah, the clocks change, but the time doesn't change. Because if you had an accurate clock that wasn't affected by gravity or any other force, it will register a different time, the correct time. Okay? So all this stuff, here's the way I would put it. I would say time cannot be measured by light because the conventional speed of light is too slow. And it also makes gravity too slow. Because if you limit light to 300,000 kilometers per second, you're going to limit gravity, which is what Einstein did, and the universe is going to fall apart. Who's the guy that talked a lot about that? He just died recently. Was it Van Flanderen? I think it was Van Flanderen. Made some great points about this whole, if gravity goes slower than light, we're doomed. Okay? That's why in our theory, we take the Planck speed at 10 to the minus 44 seconds as the speed that light, that gravity is going to go across the universe in a longitudinal wave, compression wave, not a transverse wave like light is, which is one reason why it goes so slow, because it's a transverse wave. A compression wave can really go fast. And so you can, the way we figured it, and this is in my other book, a googolplex of tiny black holes, that light or gravity goes across the universe in 10 to the minus 11 seconds. Okay? Which is what you need to hold it all together. The speed of gravity that goes the speed of light, it ain't going to work. It just ain't going to work. But anyway, getting back to time, you can't use light as a time measuring device because it's too limited, especially when you're talking about the cosmos. If you're talking about little things on Earth, where you know that light speed is always 300,000 kilometers per second or 299,782,462 kilometers per second, yeah. Okay, but as soon as you go out in outer space, light has its limitations because it moves too slow. Okay, so all this talk about using light as the measurement is a fallacy. Okay, this thing is 4 light years away. Well, that's because you've used light as the measuring device. And if you already know it's handicapped. So what are you doing that for? Okay? Now, on the other hand, if the Earth is fixed, time cannot be measured by light speed. Okay? As a matter of fact, if you go to ChatGPT and you ask it, can the special relativity theory exist with a fixed Earth? And it'll say no. They are diametrically opposed. Okay? That tells you something. That tells you something. Can't have a fixed Earth with a special relativity. Why? Because special relativity theory doesn't allow anything to be fixed. It's all relative to one another. And the way you keep time by those things that are both moving at the same time is you make something constant. It has to be the speed of light. It's the only way you're going to be able to measure the distance between those two moving objects. And even then, you're going to have to use the Lorentz contraction and time dilation to sort of fix up what light doesn't take care of. Okay? So in other words, if you make light the time measuring device, then you're going to have the Lorentz contraction and you're going to have time dilation. That is a must. And that's what special relativity is all about, is putting in these fudge factors so that you can take care of the deficiencies of the speed of light. That's finite. Okay? But you wouldn't have to do that if you had a fixed Earth. Okay? Because what you would do with a fixed Earth is you start out with an absolute. And anything that happens out there, if you know light only goes so fast, then you just compensate for that and say, well, here's the time it really happened. Because you know there's no problem with the Earth because it's not moving in relation to that thing you're trying to measure out there. It's fixed, so you have an absolute. And man, you can do a lot with an absolute. Okay? That's all you need is one absolute. You can measure the whole universe and do it very accurately. Okay? The same thing with parallax. We can use the fixed Earth to discover through parallax how far away the stars are. It can go out to 4 quadrillion light years, if you want to use the term. Not 4 quadrillion light years. I'm talking about 4 quadrillion miles, 600 light years. So I think you get the drift of what I'm saying here. Okay. Yeah, but very good questions, Nick. Thank you so much for them. You're a thinker. And this is a keeper. All right. Oh my gosh. I got to cover this because here you guys will like this. Okay. And then I'll try to get to your questions as fast as I can. Dr. Sinjanis, did I hear you correctly on a recent live show stating that there is no biblical justification for believing in a mass conversion of the Jews near the end of time, that you believe God is giving them the time now to convert, not some remote event? This makes more logical sense to me, but it seems to contradict the traditional Catholic understanding of Romans 11:25 in the Catechism. Oh boy, Patrick, did you open up a can of worms? So, yes, that's what I believe. Okay? There is no mass conversion of the Jews. That is false. To be very blunt. Okay? Here's what happened. We had some early fathers that took a very literal approach to prophecy in the Bible. They had taken a very literal approach to a lot of other difficult passages in the New Testament, like Matthew 26:26, where Jesus says, "This is my body, take and eat." We got to be honest. For somebody to interpret that literally, you are taking a big step. You must be getting that from someplace else. Because the natural tendency is to say, come on, you can't eat somebody's body. This is just gross. You say, that's your first reaction. And that's why a lot of Protestants just can't accept it. No, it's all symbolic, just, spiritual bread. Come on. It talks about Jesus dying on the cross. You Catholics. How could you? This is what threw you off the track right from the beginning. But no. Somebody told these guys, look, I know it sounds weird. It'd be much better symbol. Come on, we all know about symbolism. This is the way you interpret it. It is the body of Jesus Christ in a form that you cannot recognize him, but a form that's not real in itself. Okay? It is something else. It's not real. I mean, if you accept that interpretation, that's what makes you Catholic. Because you would never accept that logically from somebody who was trying to teach you. Let's be logical about this. Okay? You'd have to have something much higher that told you, no, you can't go that way. Okay? And so these early fathers were taught to look at Scripture literally. Okay? And that's what they did. John 3:5, man is born of water and the Spirit. The water is literal water that has the power to give you the grace of God. It's not symbolic, okay? Like mommy's washing you or something. No, this is real stuff, okay? This is the Catholic faith. That's why we call it faith, because you have to have faith to believe in stuff like that, because it's out of the ordinary. It's out of this world, okay? So that's what they were used to. And this was the Antiochian school. Everything was literal. Nobody really knew a lot about prophecy, however. Eschatology. Very young in the church. They were dealing with a lot of other things like, what's the Trinity? What's the incarnation? All that stuff. Nobody's dealing with eschatology. A few here and there, yeah. Okay. And when they came across passages, they had a tendency to interpret them literally, dealing with prophecy. And here's the thing. They had to learn that you can't do that. Can't do that. Why? Well, just read the Apocalypse. It's all filled with symbolic things. Frogs coming out of the mouth of a prophet. What does that mean? Okay? The devil put in the bottomless pit. What does that mean? Well, the devil was a spirit. Okay? I mean, these are the things that they had to grapple with, and they didn't do a very good job. Apparently, there was no apostolic tradition that said, here's the way that you interpret the Apocalypse. They had a hard enough time getting that into the Bible. It was one of the last books put into the New Testament. Okay? Much less did we have experts on eschatology to go and interpret it for us. Okay? So you have to bear all this in mind when we're figuring out, okay, so when they come to Romans 11:25, it says, 26, and all Israel shall be saved, and there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, who will take away the sins of Jacob, and blah, 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 blah. What are you going to do with it? If you're prone to interpret that literally, you're going to say, oh, well, all Israel's going to be saved. You're not going to tear that thing apart and find out exactly what it means. There's going to be a covenant made with the Jews, with Israel. It's going to be from a deliverer. Who's that? Well, they thought it might be Elijah. They thought it might be Jeremiah. They thought it might be Moses. They all had all kinds of ideas of who the deliverer might be. And sometime in the future. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that passage, Romans 11:25, 27, and we're going to combine that with Apocalypse 20. And Apocalypse 20 talks about what? Some of you say Revelation 20. There's an angel came down from heaven with a chain in his hand, grabbed a hold of the devil, chained him up, put him in the bottomless pit, and he shall be there for 1,000 years. Okay? And then verse 4 comes along and says, and I saw the souls of them who were beheaded, and they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, and so on and so on. And it mentions the 1,000 years 6 times. So if you're a literalist, you've been trained to look at the Bible literally for the sake of the Catholic faith, you see, because you interpreted literally, this is my body, take and eat. And you did, and you kept faithful, and that's what the Catholic faith is. And now you come to the 1,000 years. And nobody's trained you in eschatology. Nobody's trained you to exegete these passages and look at all kinds of scriptures. And you have no help because you're young. There's hardly anybody that you can. Nobody has the internet to communicate back. Hey, what do you think of this passage? What do you think of that? They live miles apart. Okay. And they're dealing with all kinds of stuff. And the guys that were doing this were Papias, okay, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Hippolytus, Lactantius, Tertullian, all the young fathers who could barely communicate with one another were looking at Apocalypse 20. It said 1,000 years, that must be a literal 1,000 years. And that's what they were waiting for. And there were few, if any, saying anything different. There were some, like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Eusebius, Dionysius of Alexandria, Cyprian, were saying, yeah, hold on here a minute. This is different language than Matthew 26:26. Okay? This is not Jesus saying, this is my body. Okay, we have a right not to look at that literally. I mean, at least symbolically, to look at it literally, because he says, this is my body. But, come on, 1,000 years, bottomless pit, frogs coming out of the prophet, 7 spirits of God, you could go down the list. Almost everything in the apocalypse is symbolic. They're written in this weird language. And so, we're not so sure. And so they were the first anti-Chiliasts. The Chiliasts were those that believed in the 1,000 years. And these were the first anti-Chiliasts. Clement of these old, around the same time. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Dionysius of Alexandria. Not many, though, okay, but enough that there was an opposing voice. But the main fight, you know them, Papias, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, they're the most famous. And they wrote the most. Okay? So they got to be more popular. And so when they took their interpretation of a literal 1,000 years from Apocalypse 20, and they combined it with their literal interpretation of the deliverer that comes to save the Jews in Romans 11, 25 and 26, what do you think they're going to do? Yeah, they said the Jews are all going to be saved, and Jesus is going to come back and reign in Jerusalem and for 1,000 years. And the Jews are going to reign with him, and there's going to be 144,000 of them. Exactly. And they get that from Apocalypse 7 and Apocalypse 14. Okay? So completely literal as they could make it. There's some stuff that they couldn't literalize, but the stuff that they could, that's what they interpret. So that's why they're called Chiliasts, because they believe in 1,000 years of Jews reigning on earth who have been saved by this deliverer who comes to make a covenant with them. So in other words, they put it all to the second coming of Christ. Okay? That's what they did. Now Augustine comes along, and Chrysostom, and they're from the Alexandrian school of exegesis, not Antiochian. That's why Augustine says a lot of the interpretations of the early fathers, I believe because the church told me. He can figure them out himself. Okay. And Augustine had a penchant to look at things allegorically, symbolically. So when it comes to looking at the apocalypse, it's right up his alley. He sees all this symbolism all over the place, and he has no qualms about interpreting it allegorically or symbolically. Whereas the early fathers would have, they would never do that. So Augustine says, no, the 1,000 years isn't literal. It's symbolic of the first coming of Christ, where his death on the cross subdued the devil and put him like in the bottomless pit, so to speak. And he can't come out again until the end. So he's there for like 1,000 years, which is a long time. You see, that's what Augustine said. It begins at the first coming of Christ, the 1,000 years, because it's symbolic and symbolic of the whole church period, right up until the time Jesus comes. So you got the early fathers saying it's the second coming. You got the Augustine and his crowd saying it's the first coming. And so guess what? There's going to be problems. Because if you can't get the timing right, don't start exegeting the passage because it'll be wrong. Because you don't know where it's taking place, when it's taking place. So that's the problem with the early church and this whole, tradition that started to leak out afterwards. So what did Augustine do? Well, he knew of these early fathers, right? And he wanted to have respect for them. But he's already jettisoned their literal view of the 1,000 years. Okay? But maybe there's something he can keep from them so that he doesn't make them all wrong. Because if he didn't do that, then they would be all wrong eschatologically. They wouldn't know what the heck they were doing. Okay? So what he does is he keeps the part that talks about a conversion of the Jews, because I don't know, maybe he wanted to have respect for that's what the early fathers thought. Okay? And here's the problem, however. He has no place to put them. At least the early fathers had a place to put the Jews who were converted en masse in this future 1,000-year literal time period in Jerusalem, with Jesus sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. They had a place to put them for 1,000 years. Augustine had no place. So if he wants to keep this conversion, what do you do with him? So he struggles with this. First, he talks about, well, maybe they'll be converted when Jesus comes back, the day they come back. Really? Or maybe there'll be a little time before Jesus comes back that we can put these Jews. Really? Where does Scripture talk about that? See, there is nothing else. He's got Romans 11, that's it. Because no other passage talks about time, place, numbers, about Jews being converted en masse. No other place. So you either get it out of Romans 11 or you don't. Okay? And so, if Augustine had done this, if he had taken the 1,000 years that he said was symbolic, and he said started at the first coming of Christ at the cross, and he kept with that paradigm, then he would have not been confused. Okay, because that means Romans 11, 25, 26, and 27 have to fit in when? At the first coming of Christ. And then it all makes sense. Okay, why? Because the covenant that Jesus makes, he's the deliverer, right? It says the deliverer will come out of Zion in Romans 11, 27. Who's a deliverer? Well, it's nobody but Jesus. And it says, and he will make a covenant with them. Who makes covenants? Jesus does. He made the new covenant, okay, of his blood. And it says, and he will forgive the sins of Jacob. Well, which covenant forgives sins? Some future covenant? No, there is no future covenant. The only covenant that forgives sins is the new covenant in Christ. That forgives the Jews' sins. But it forgives Gentiles too. Okay? So the next question is, well, how do the Jews fit in? Does all Israel in verse 26 mean that every Jew is going to be saved? Where do we find that in Scripture? That every Jew is going to be saved? It ain't there. And in the context of Romans 11, it tells us that it ain't real. Because in verse 14, Paul says, if I may save some of the Jews by making them jealous. Okay, the word some is not all, is it? It's some. He doesn't have any delusions of grandeur here. Like, yeah, someday I'm going to save all the Jews. I'm going to make them all jealous. And they're all going to turn to Jesus. Yeah, that may be what a Pentecostal preacher preaches, but not St. Paul. He's a realist, you see. And then in verse 23, another deterrent to this whole, all the Jews are going to be saved. He says, they can be regrafted. Who's they? The Jews can be regrafted into the olive tree, which what? Shows you that they're not the olive tree. Okay? That's another mistake people make. They can't be regrafted into the olive tree if they're already the olive tree. So it says they can be regrafted into the olive tree if they choose to believe. Very clear. There's a condition on there that's going to have to be fit in with all the rest of what Romans 11 says, and it ain't very good. Okay? Because Paul makes it clear that, look, we've tried to save these Jews, and they refuse. It happened in Elijah's time, where millions of Jews had the gospel in their heart because Elijah preached it to them, and all he could get was 7,000 who didn't worship the devil. That's what it says right in Romans 11, right at the beginning. And Paul says, has God forsaken the Jews? No, because I'm a Jew. I converted to Christ, but he's one guy. Yeah. Can Paul point anybody else out there? No, he doesn't do that. He points himself out. Now, granted, there's a lot more. There's like 25,000 more Jews. But at the end of the book of Acts, what does Paul say about the Jews? He tried to convert them. He tried. For like 15 chapters, he's not having any luck converting the Jews. So he goes to the Gentiles. And he has one last shot at the Jews in Acts 28. And they refuse to believe. And he says, you know what? You're just fulfilling the scripture that said you were blind and you will remain blind. That's the last word he has in the book of Acts about the Jews. Okay? So, of course, he's not expecting any salvation of, delusions of grandeur about the Jews. He's already told us that he's pessimistic and he can save some of them, but not that many. Okay? And then we find this other passage here where, there's so much more. Oh, gosh. I'll cover this next week. Let me get to my questions here because I got 20 minutes left. But it's really important, and I'm going to get to it next week. Because you asked about the catechism. Boy, have I got some things to say about the catechism. And about if the reconciliation of them is the salvation of the world, what will be the bringing back of the Jews? And if everybody looks at it and says, oh, that means there's going to be a mass conversion of Jews. No, it doesn't. Okay, so we'll look at that. All right. All right. If generative AI is a truth-seeking engine, does the Holy Ghost, as a spirit of truth, works with sanctifying grace through AI on the soul of the human user of AI? Who knows? I mean, as long as AI tells the truth, and I know this, you're going to get more truth out of AI than you are in talking to a human being who has a bias. Like, when I talk science to a professor or whoever, they are immediately biased toward the Copernican principle and against geocentrism. And they got some, choice words for you. And AI doesn't cuss at you. AI takes all the information that it's available to them, and there's a lot, and makes a synthesis of it and tells you what it is. Okay? And even though it's going to defend the status quo, things will slip through it that if you ask the question in the right way, it answers truthfully and says, yeah, that's possible. Whereas one of the biased humans that I would talk to, that's impossible. What are you talking about? The earth could never be fiction. You're crazy. All that kind of stuff. AI doesn't do that. The thing is, the Holy Spirit doesn't lead any of them. AI is just doing what naturally comes to it because that's what it was programmed to do. They just didn't realize how truthful AI was going to be with all that knowledge that's out there. You see, that's one thing that's not working in their favor. And we can use it to our advantage in the war of truth. Okay? How the Holy Spirit leads is a mystery. It's a great mystery. We just know he's fully aware of everything and works it out as he sees fit. And that's about all we know. Okay? So, anyway. Dear Robert, would you say that both our churches should venerate Clement of Alexandria as saint, as Eastern Catholics, since Saint Photius attributed to him things he never taught due to mistranslation? I don't know, Lions boy. You're really getting some detailed stuff in there. I don't have any opinion on that. I first have to see what's mistranslated and all that for me to make a judgment. Dr. Jonathan, nice to see you again from New Zealand. Thank you for coming. Question: it seems that the Catholic Answers crowd are afraid to debate you on evolution and geocentrism. What do you think of this? Yeah, they've been afraid for years. Okay, they're afraid to debate me on any topic. To be honest with you, I've tried to debate them before on many other things other than these science issues. They won't. Okay, they want to silence me as much as they can. If they give entertainment to debating me, that means I'll be on their programs and people will hear what I have to say, and they're scared of that. Okay? They don't want that to happen. So the only thing they can do is ignore me. And they do a good job of that. Okay? They will ignore me because that means they're not going to be in competition with me. Now, I've made sure that on certain occasions I do compete with them on YouTube, for example. Thank God for YouTube, where I take apart every sentence that they say and make my critique of it. And it lasts for an hour or two, and they're all on my YouTube channel. Anybody can go and see them. And there's thousands of people that have. So I know I am reaching. So the more they ignore me, the more I feel compelled and responsible to answer them when these issues come up. And Jimmy Akin, for example, this guy has gone off the rails. I don't know where he's getting half the ideas that he comes up with, but he's got something new almost every week that he's spouting as some Catholic doctrine. And man, if I had the opportunity, I would definitely challenge him on most of the things he says. And he's even got this theory about polygenism. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. And see, because he knows that Pius XII has said that Catholics cannot believe in evolution because no one has an answer to the problem of polygenism. Now, polygenism is the idea that there were multiple millions of apes or hominids, as they want to say, that turned into humans all at the same time. That's what secular evolutionists believe. That it wasn't one man or one woman, it was multiple men or multiple hominids that turned into men. Millions, you say, at the same time. The Catholic Church says, no, no, no. There can only be one man or one hominid that turns into a man, and that man has to be approached by God, communicated with by God, and he has to be told what the parameters are and to see if he will obey or disobey, and he falls into original sin. And then it is transferred to the whole human race, because then only do humans produce humans, you see. So obviously evolution is not going to accept that. And Pius XII said in Humani Generis, you cannot believe in evolution unless you find a solution that is officially approved, by the way, not something that you dream up yourself, approved by the Vatican, and the Vatican will then affirm or deny and say, okay, now we have the official answer to polygenism. You can believe in evolution. That hasn't happened, and I can tell you it ain't going to happen. Okay, but Jimmy Akin, he thinks he's got an answer. And he goes about which way, this way, that way, all kinds of ways to try to defend it. I heard this about a year ago. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He just makes it up as he goes along. And even if he came up with something that was plausible, you've got to pass this by the Vatican to see if they approve of it. And then it can be disseminated to people. But until, if and when, forget about it, buddy. Okay? But he takes leaps and bounds on all kinds of aliens, and it's just like, if I was that crazy about my theology, man, they'd be the first people to come after me. But they'll accept all this stuff, polygenism, aliens, Bigfoot, everything. They'll all accept, but geocentrism? No, we can't accept that. Because the scientists have all told us that it's not right. Yeah, and so they won't listen to any geocentric scientists. They won't listen to any Protestant creationists. They only listen, as Jimmy puts it, to mainstream science. Well, what do you think they're going to tell you? Yeah. So, he's gone off the rails, as far as I'm concerned. And any time he wants to debate me, I will debate him. Or anybody from Catholic Answers, Trent Horn included. Tim Staples, whoever wants to debate the issues, I'll be glad to debate them. But they won't. They hardly know I exist anymore. That's how much they've ignored me. So that's their choice. Okay. I just do my thing, and that's all I can do. All right. Today is Ember Day. Are you celebrating? No, I don't even know what Ember Day is. Sorry. I saw you with Dr. Owen and Father Ribbicher doing a talk. Has Father Ribbicher come around to believe in geocentrism? Yes, he has. He's learning about it, okay, but he has come to believe it. Are there any Eastern Orthodox or any Church of East teachings on geocentrism that is in line with Hildegard's vision? I don't know. I really don't know much about the Eastern Church in that regard. what's the church's view on end of life palliative care? Um, well, the church would um, say that everything that can be done to keep the person alive should be done. And only in extreme circumstances would you be able to pull the plug, as it were. And you'd have to get permission from the church if you're a Catholic to do that. Otherwise, the standing rule is you keep them alive as long as possible. Now, there are issues where, okay, if we didn't give them the medicine, they wouldn't stay alive, which is going to initiate the discussion about, okay, are we artificially keeping them alive to the point where they would die immediately if we didn't sort of prop them up? And that's a judgment call now. That's, when you have to consider everything that's involved, and you make a judgment call, somebody with authority, and says, okay, we're just artificially propping them up. It's like, it's a Frankenstein or something that just pumped with drugs just to keep them animated. Is that life? You see. And we've reached the point in our science where we can decide those things. We have enough, knowledge about the body and about how it works, and to make those judgments. Okay. Sometimes we're totally wrong. Somebody will wake up and we think they're dead. That's happened before. So it's not a perfect science. Okay. But at least we can talk about it. All right. Anna says, since God is timeless, is time, according to time theory B, a fourth dimension of space? God is living in his presence, and we, the three-dimensional beings, are moving through fourth dimension. Okay. First of all, there is no fourth dimension. There is no fifth dimension, although there was a singing group back in the 60s named the Fifth Dimension. If you're going by Euclidean geometry, there are only three dimensions. Okay. The guy who created the so-called fourth dimension is Einstein, and that's because of his special relativity theory, where if you contract the length of a moving object, you have to dilate the time. No questions asked. You have to also dilate the time. Now, what does all that mean? Let me try to explain it real short. Let's say you have a log, okay, and you're moving the log from point A to point B, okay? And the rule from Einstein is that anything that moves is contracted in its length as it moves. Anything. Just the way I move my hand across there means the length of my hand is contracted. Now, it might be, a trillionth of a micron, but the fact is, theoretically, it's still shrunk. Okay? Why did he have to do that? Because he had to keep the Earth moving. The only way to keep the Earth moving in the Michelson-Morley experiment was to say that the length of the measuring device shrunk just enough to mask the Earth moving around the sun. In other words, it gave a false positive for a fixed Earth that didn't move. Okay, how do you explain that? Well, we'll blame it on the machine. The machine must have shrunk somehow. Well, we don't know how. It's just a principle of nature. It shrunk. Okay, so if it shrunk, here, let's use this pencil. If the pencil starts out at point A and goes to point B, okay, point B is here, but it shrinks as it goes, okay, so that means, let's say the pencil's only that long because it shrunk from being this long. All right, it's just this long. So if you start out at point A and you go to point B, are you going to be able to get there in the same time to point B if your pencil has been shrunk? No. Isn't that something? It's going to take what? More time to get to B. because your pencil shrunk. So that's called time dilation. You have to dilate the time to make up for the difference in the fact that you just claimed that the pencil shrunk. Okay? So what happens then? Well, mass, the three-dimensional log, length, width, and height, is totally intertwined with time. Now, you cannot separate the two, you see. So what do we have now? We've got space-time. Just another way of saying there's nothing out there called space-time. Like there's no substance. You can't put your hand through it. Okay? It's just a mathematical thumbadiddy to try to combine the idea of Euclidean geometry and time together in one concept. And that's what Einstein tried to do a lot. Space-time, electromagnetism, he tried to make everything relative, and the only way you can do that is take the distinctions out of them and make them one. Okay? So that's where it comes from. Okay? But there is no fourth dimension. That's just a term that is used to make it look like there's another dimension. Okay? There are only three dimensions, and we learned that from Euclid, and it ain't going to improve or change. Okay? All right. Okay, question. Got a few minutes left. Given we believe that dinosaurs were created in the beginning with man, what explanation do you think is the reason they are all extinct today? The weather changed drastically. The weather changed drastically because the flood caused it. Okay, you had a pretty pristine environment before the flood. That's why men could live so longer themselves. They were living to Shem was 600 when he died, and after the flood, right after Shem, the ages go down to 400. And then after a couple hundred years, they go down to 200. That's a pretty rapid drop. Okay. So you could tell something's changed. So either the physiology got changed somehow to have a more rapid decline in age, or the environment changed where it got colder and less pressure, or both happened. Now, if you have less pressure and you have a colder climate, you're going to have drastic change on any organic specimen, including the dinosaurs. Now, look, these guys need a lot of food. And if you have drastic changes in the climate, you're not going to have as much vegetation. And so they could starve to death if there were, so many of them proliferated after the flood. They just couldn't make it anymore. Plus, you have a cold climate. Lizards need a warm climate. So, there's a lot of factors involved there. But, you add them all together, and that's why they became extinct. But you do find dinosaur tracks with human tracks. That is for sure. Okay? They can't be denied. I mean, there was just I saw a story a little while ago about Richard Dawkins, Jay Gould from Harvard, and I forget the other guy. They all went to this little hut, was what it was, where this, what's his name? The creationist guy. I know him. I've met him. I forget his name, though. And this was before they made a big facility. He had his little hut with excavations of their own that they did of dinosaur prints with human prints. And he showed them, Dawkins and Gould. And the other guy, third guy there, I forget what university he's from, but he said, yes, they are human prints in Cretaceous sand, which means it's dinosaur sand. That's one thing. And I cannot deny that there is a human footprint inside this dinosaur footprint. And they had promised before he showed them these things that they were going to change their mind if you could prove that dinosaurs lived with humans. And so they were shown this. They had no idea he had this stuff. They were shown this. They admitted it. At least one of the guys admitted it. And he says, well, now what are you going to do? He goes, well, we're not going to do anything. And they walked out. They walked out. See, so it's more than scientific evidence. It's the heart of man. That's the problem. All right. Okay, so Rodrigo says, I'm a Brazilian. We say dogma in Portuguese. Oh, so you use the English word. Is that what you're saying? Well, then why did they use Guerra? Why did Sister Lucia use Guerra? That just makes it even more obvious to me. She's not using the word dogma, even though Portuguese can use the word dogma. Okay, and she doesn't use doctrina. She would use doutrina, doutrina. As far as the Portuguese is concerned, there's no C in there, but she doesn't use that either. Okay, so it is Guerra. You're affirming that for me. All right. Question: the Big Bangers say CMB is from the Big Bang. What do you geocentrists say it's from? What do we say is that the great light that was made on the first day of creation, which is different from the sun and the stars, as you know, because they're made on the fourth day. That light is very big. We're talking about probably 600 billion miles in radius. Okay, so that's 1,200 billion miles, or 1.2 trillion miles in diameter. And that light is stretched out, as I was saying earlier. All the verses in the Bible that say God stretched out the heavens, well, the light was stretched out with it. Okay, most of that light was used to make the stars. And you can calculate based on how big the great light was and how big the stars are and how many of them there are, that all the stars could come from this great light. And then there would be some left over. Okay, so that light would go to the rim of the universe. And that's the background radiation, you see, because that's what the Big Bangers think is the source of the cosmic radiation, the background, you see. And that's where we have the radiation come from, the background, which is the boundary of the universe. And then there's water on top of that in the form of ice. So all this light that was created in the first now has a sink, so to speak. And a lot of it was made in the stars and the galaxies and everything. And there's even more of it. Because as scientists have found, over 50% of the light, if you shut off all the light from the galaxies, the stars, quasars, everything, there's still 50% light left. Where did that come from? Well, we have the answer. It came from the great light that God created on the first day, you see. And then the residual of that is at the boundary. Not very thick, but it's enough to make a radiation that permeates the rest of the universe at a very isotropic temperature of 2.75 degrees Kelvin, which we would expect it to be, just a little above zero. And the ice, the water is ice, of course, at that low temperature as well, so everything fits. Okay, so we're done today, and I'll see you next week. That would be June the 18th, Wednesday, 3 to 5. And if you haven't stopped by our website, here it is. I'll give it to you, robertsongenis.org, with all kinds of products for you, books and DVDs and all kinds of things. So visit there, and if you can, leave us a little donation so that we can keep going. Thank you so much. God bless you all. I hope I have moved you along the pathway toward your Lord Jesus Christ, more so than at the beginning of the program. That is my goal, to help you.